Ah oui. Est-ce que j'attends le cue? Ah oui, OK. OK. Bon matin. Je vais vous inviter à vous asseoir. Ça va sûrement continuer à entrer un peu, mais on va commencer. On a une journée bien remplie. Donc, bien, ça me fait plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette 28e édition des JASP. Il y a plusieurs visages que je connais, mais pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Julie Laulier et j'ai l'honneur de présider le comité organisateur des JASP. Donc, cette année, le thème « À vos marques, prêtes et prêts pour les JASP ». On peut dire que ça prend tout son sens. Hein? Quand on pense à vos marques, on pense à se positionner. On pense à une ligne de départ et on peut dire que c'est une année qui s'annonce marquante pour la santé publique. On a un nouveau programme national de santé publique qui s'en vient, une nouvelle stratégie de prévention en santé. On espère que ça va être une phase de renouveau qui va nous pousser à aller plus loin, à faire mieux, à innover. Cela dit, on ne peut pas passer sous silence qu'on amorce quand même les prochains mois avec un certain vent de face. Il y a une part du réseau de santé publique, mais aussi de ses partenaires qui vit dans une certaine incertitude. Ça peut donner un sentiment de perte de repère. Je pense que plus que jamais, c'est une occasion pour nous de réaffirmer nos valeurs, de réaffirmer nos convictions et notre désir d'agir pour une santé publique qui est forte et qui est résiliente. Pendant les 3 prochains jours, on va réfléchir, on va échanger, on va débattre, mais surtout, on va s'inspirer les uns des autres. Ça va aussi être un moment pour nous unir et nous soutenir dans la bienveillance. Avant d'aller plus loin et de se lancer dans ces 3 journées qui s'annoncent bien remplies, j'aimerais qu'on prenne un moment pour reconnaître le territoire sur lequel on va se réunir pour les 3 prochains jours et rendre hommage au peuple qui l'habitait bien avant nous et l'habite encore. Pour ceux qui sont en présence dans la salle ici, on se trouve sur le territoire non cédé de la nation Kanien'kehá:ka. Vous êtes aussi plusieurs en ligne à vous trouver sur les terres ancestrales des 11 nations autochtones du Canada. Ces premiers peuples ont depuis des milliers d'années habité et gardé les terres où on se trouve aujourd'hui. Par cette reconnaissance, je nous invite à nourrir notre volonté d'apprendre ensemble, d'écouter avec humilité et de bâtir des ponts durables entre nos histoires et notre futur. Finalement, avant de passer la parole à Nicolas, je souhaite prendre un moment pour remercier chacune des personnes qui a permis d'organiser ces journées de santé publique. C'est une grosse organisation. Je nommerai pas tout le monde, mais notamment les 7 partenaires du consortium qui, je crois, devaient à un moment donné être affichés sur l'écran. Si ce n'est pas le cas, ça se trouve dans le programme. On a encore cette année des journées qui sont très riches et un beau panel d'activités en marge. D'ailleurs, 2 petits mots sur les activités en marge d'aujourd'hui. Ce midi, il y a une conférence de l'ISQ à la salle Outremont 1 qui portera sur les 25 ans d'études sur la violence familiale envers les enfants. Et ce soir, c'est le 5 à 7 organisé par l'ASPQ où il y aura remise de prix hommage. C'était sur inscription, mais on m'a soufflé dans l'oreille qu'il resterait de la place. Donc, s'il y en a qui sont intéressés à se joindre au 5 à 7 de l'ASPQ, vous êtes les bienvenus. Donc voilà, je céderai maintenant la parole à Nicolas, qui est le président finalement du conseil scientifique.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Donc, pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, mon nom c'est Nicolas Parenteau. Je suis médecin spécialiste en santé publique à l'Institut national de santé publique du Québec et j'ai vraiment le privilège de présider le comité scientifique des journées annuelles de santé publique. Comme vous vous en doutez, ça a été une année avec des eaux mouvementées. Ça a été pas nécessairement facile, mais on a réussi à arriver à bon port là, avec un programme qui est riche de 18 activités thématiques. Ces 18 activités-là sont chacune mises en place par 18 comités scientifiques qui ont travaillé toute l'année pour vous offrir une programmation de qualité. Puis comme vous avez peut-être vu passer là, la semaine dernière, on a envoyé également un appel à proposition pour avoir des nouvelles activités, donc les nouvelles JASP pour l'année prochaine. Comme vous savez, la qualité des gestes, ça dépend avant tout des propositions qui sont soumises. Donc, on vous invite vraiment à réfléchir, à vous travailler ensemble, à nous soumettre des propositions, puis ça va vraiment nous faire plaisir de les évaluer, puis de vous offrir une programmation riche pour la prochaine année. Avant de débuter, 2 petits points. Là, tout d'abord, je vous invite là, pendant les pauses, pendant le dîner, à aller visiter les communications affichées. Il y en a une quarantaine d'affiches là, qui ont été mises. Donc, vraiment aller faire le tour, puis vous faites discuter avec les personnes qui les ont soumises. Puis l'autre, c'est plus pour ceux qui ont demandé des crédits de formation. N'oubliez pas d'aller signer si vous voulez les avoir à la fin. Donc, sans plus tarder, nous avons la chance d'accueillir professeur Barrington-Leigh pour une conférence intitulée « Le bien-être subjectif comme guide pour les politiques publiques ». Les objectifs de la présentation là, de la plénière, c'est d'expliquer les possibles effets bénéfiques de la satisfaction de vie dans l'orientation des politiques, ainsi que comparer l'approche de la satisfaction de vie à d'autres mesures d'évaluation utilisées en santé publique. Christopher Barrington-Leigh est professeur à l'Université McGill, co-titulaire du Département d'équité, d'éthique et de politique et de l'École de l'environnement Bieler. Il est fondateur du réseau canadien de connaissances sur le bien-être, directeur du World Wellbeing Panel et président du groupe de recherche sur l'économie du bonheur de l'Association canadienne d'économie. Ces recherches portent sur les évaluations empiriques et quantitatives de la satisfaction à l'égard de la vie humaine et sur leur implication pour les politiques économiques, sociales et environnementales. Christopher Barrington-Leigh s'appuie sur des enquêtes, des expériences et des modèles économiques théoriques réalisés à l'échelle nationale, mais aussi internationale, pour comprendre le bonheur individuel, collectif et même mondial. Ces autres champs d'expertise comprennent, de façon générale, la transition vers le développement durable, notamment la transition énergétique en Chine, et le rôle des réseaux de rues résidentielles dans la consolidation des futurs résultats environnementaux et sociaux liés à la forme urbaine à l'échelle mondiale. Christopher Barrington-Leigh donne des cours sur l'économie du bien-être et de l'environnement. Il a suivi une formation en physique des plasmas des couches supérieures de l'atmosphère et de l'espace au Massachusetts Institute of Technology, à Stanford et à Berkeley, avant de se réorienter vers l'économie à l'University of British Columbia. Christopher Barrington-Leigh s'intéresse à la vision constructive et optimiste de l'avenir à moyen et long terme. Il pense qu'il est essentiel de tenir compte du bien-être subjectif global dans l'élaboration des politiques synergiques et complètes. Bonne écoute. Ah oui, pardon.
Merci à vous tous. Merci d'avoir abordé ce sujet pour JASP cette année. Et je suis honoré d'être parmi vous. Sur les conseils d'une collègue, je vais m'exprimer en anglais, mais je suis ouvert aux questions dans les 2 langues. The takeaway from my introduction is that I am not an expert in public health. And I want to share the perspective of an economist on how a measurable definition of well-being can be useful to, and how to use such evidence to guide policy. In fact, I became an economist because I thought we could not solve the world's problems without having a better idea of what success means for society. So I want to speak to you today, in some sense, about the meaning of life. Please take a second to reflect. What do you wish for your loved ones, for your children? What would you ask someone you care a lot about in order to find out whether that wish was being fulfilled? So I want to tell you about an approach that economists have been using for the last few decades to evaluate quality of life overall. And I want to advocate for why it's important to differentiate this kind of measure and research from health. I want to tell you about how life satisfaction is being used now in policy, and tell you some limitations, and leave you with a call to action. So the advantage of of what I want to talk to you about is that it has an exceedingly clear and precise definition. And so this approach that's sometimes known as happiness economics is one in which we quantify life quality using answers to a single survey question that goes something like, it's okay up there, it goes something like this. Taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? Now, without going into all the details of the cognitive processes that we think people have to go through when they answer this question, I would ask you to note that this is different from asking people about their emotions, or for instance, technically, happiness. So this is not asking about psychological affect, which is more of a fleeting feeling. It's also, most importantly, not asking about what people think is important for a good life, or what they think is driving the current state of their life, whether they think it good or bad. Instead, it just focuses on each respondent as the world's expert on how their own life feels, taking everything into account cognitively and affectively as they like. People are not the world's expert on how it might feel to live through states and experiences which they have not lived through. So that's the philosophy of embracing such a subjective and wildly open question. Let me clarify a little bit more of the terminology. The topic of this talk is subjective well-being, but that's actually a larger class of different measures. And I already mentioned that we could, and we do, ask about people's momentary feelings on the left, but those are not as interesting, and they relate a little bit less to the enduring circumstances of life. Another category, sometimes called eudaimonia, refers to a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And the one we're most interested in is the cognitive evaluations. Now, you could ask someone to evaluate a narrow domain of their life cognitively. So, for instance, you could ask somebody how satisfied they are with their state of health. But economists are more interested in the one that leaves absolutely everything up to the individual respondent. We just ask how life is overall. I sometimes think of the differentiation between this and the affective feelings as whether you are probing just your limbic system or you're using your cortex, in which case what your limbic system tells you may be useful as evidence, but it's not driving the answer. Now, it's important to appreciate that we have answers to this life satisfaction question from many millions of people at this point. The question has been translated for more than 150 countries where it's fielded every year. A number of OECD countries have detailed panel surveys in which individuals' life satisfaction is tracked over many years. Statistics Canada has been asking Canadians this question since 1985, and if you visit the website lifesatisfaction.ca, you can see life satisfaction averages down to the community level. Here's Quebec, here's Montreal. I do have to mention that life satisfaction is on a somewhat serious and sustained decline in Canada. This is, there's of course always lots of detail behind averages, but partly driving this overall trend is that young people in Canada are particularly suffering. Interestingly, in Quebec, Francophone youth are not in as much of a decline as the Anglophones in this regard, nor as much as in most other Anglophone countries at the moment. But for some reason, this is not in the headlines every day, and I think it should be, maybe not least because politicians should be paying attention for their own self-interest. We know that life satisfaction predicts whether a government is voted out in the next election, and it does so better than income changes, in other words, growth, unemployment, and inflation combined. So, without trying to give a whole talk on what we know so far on those trends, I want to give you a broader summary of everything that's been learned in the 50 years of research in this field. And in some sense, that's relatively easy, because the summary is that, maybe to the surprise of nobody except for economists, we are very social beings. To give you some examples, feeling a sense of dignity is at least as important as getting enough calories. Being able to trust your coworkers is more important than doubling your income. Being able to help others and being useful to others are not costs, but seem to be core needs for satisfaction. Now, some parts of this news about us being social beings is, of course, not news to aficionados of the social determinants of health. But subjective well-being measurement reveals where health interventions have comparative advantage versus other levers, and gives us a way to value different kinds of interventions and different intermediate outcomes in proportion to how much they affect overall quality of life. And it turns out that, that many health outcomes are probably, and just like other material outcomes, probably end up being important in large part to the extent that they affect our ability to connect with others. In other words, to maintain our social identity, our ability to contribute, and our social relationships. Here's an example of a study that explains variance in life satisfaction using variance in some of its determinants. So the bars show how much of the differences across people are accounted for by various factors. You can see that having diagnosed physical health conditions is important, but not nearly as much as mental illness. Income is important, but having a close relationship or having an enjoyable job is even more important than income. The ideal of being able to make evidence-informed policy based on this kind of knowledge requires a large database of causal inference. Here's an example of what that might look like. We could call it a database of happiness coefficients. And to zoom in, here's just a few examples of what those numbers look like. Doubling an individual's household income has an expected effect of only 0.16 on the 0 to 10 scale of life satisfaction. That's similar but opposite to the value of going from never smoking to smoking daily. But those are tiny compared to the difference in expected life satisfaction between somebody who has a partner and somebody who has recently become separated from their partner. It's also small compared to feeling unsafe or of not feeling seen at work. I sometimes like to summarize all of our knowledge in this field by saying that humans want to feel safe, to feel loved, and to feel useful. Now, for the epidemiologists in the audience, you're wondering about causality. A fun thing about life satisfaction is that, for sure, everything you can think of affects it. And so the causal relationships are naturally also complex. However, there is now a growing body of experimental evidence in a number of domains of the determinants of life satisfaction. And since life satisfaction is just one question on a survey, it's actually not hard to add as an outcome in RCT studies. So how should this kind of knowledge get used in policymaking? As you can intuit from what I've just shown you, a full system of cost-benefit analysis based on life satisfaction as the outcome measure would be able to value a wide range of different policy impacts in a common currency. This would allow decision makers to value policy contributions across traditional silos, such as health, education, urban services, and on and on. And this approach is now official guidance from the UK for the UK Treasury. They have a supplement to their Green Book on how to incorporate well-being into cost-benefit analysis. And there are also detailed academic accounts of how to do this based on a concept of well-being years, or well-bees. One well-be is one step on that 0 to 10 scale for 1 year for one person. So think back to that first question I asked you. You now know one possible answer for how to operationalize a truly broad concept for quality of life. How does this relate to public health? The pitch for public health is that life satisfaction is a common yardstick that lets public health demonstrate its value alongside other policy domains. Let me give you an example of weighing impacts across domains. Here's a paper from 2020, and by the way, Mark Carney cited this paper in the first chapter of his book, Values, Building a Better World for All. We'd like to remind him of that sometimes. So this paper uses life satisfaction evidence to calculate costs and benefits of all the measurable consequences of releasing the lockdown during COVID lockdown in the UK. So it includes impacts of income, unemployment, mental health. And you can see that more deaths are expected from releasing the lockdown from COVID, but also from things like traffic as people get back on the streets. And also pollution is expected to go up, which has a negative cost on well-being. When you quantify these effects in terms of well-being and add the different effects over time, you can see that the authors suggested that June 1st would be the right time to release the lockdown, i.e. when the balance shifted in favor, according to the positive number at the bottom. So these numbers are in units of 10,000 well-being years or well-bees. And again, you can see now, how having a common currency of quantifiable well-being allows decision-making across the traditional domains of policy and puts the health impacts into perspective with other impacts on quality of life. One more perspective on the scope of well-being compared with the scope of health, consider this. In a study in which we project how much policies are likely to matter for global well-being by 2050, likely, I should say, for changes to global average life satisfaction, to be specific, we find that advances or declines in income and health are unlikely to make anywhere near as much impact as advances and declines in some social circumstances, including institutional trust, social relationships, and sense of freedom to make decisions. Just to be really explicit then about this conceptual hierarchy in the life satisfaction approach, well-being is not a part of some unified concept that includes health, and it's not a part of mental health inside health. Instead, life satisfaction captures the influence of all of life's objective circumstances, one domain of which is health. So one of the strengths of the life satisfaction approach, then, is its clarity about the difference between objectives and determinants. Let me give a somewhat concrete example of what I mean there. Sometimes when using concepts such as the social determinants of health, or in light of sweeping definitions of health, like the WHO's, we might lose clarity about what the target outcome is and what the empirical evidence is about. I think life satisfaction can help to organize this evidence. For instance, many social determinants of health affect well-being through other paths than morbidity. When a public health view may look at housing, income, employment as promoting health, those things also affect life satisfaction through routes which are really not to do with what most people understand as health. Just to drive home the point of this, because for me it's profound, life satisfaction occurs in the brain. In the life satisfaction approach to well-being, things matter ultimately only because of how they're experienced. Now, of course, we would lose confidence in this if we found that people overly adapted to their objective states, to bad objective states, or good ones, I suppose, but we know they don't. Or rather, we know exactly what they do and don't adapt to, and by how much. If we want to focus on a policy targeting social determinants of health because they improve health outcomes, we could be missing out on some of the strongest reasons and evidence to support those same policies because they're beneficial to people through other channels than avoiding disease. As one example of how a well-being approach informs public policy, consider the language we currently use around mental health, which in both English and French is a euphemism for the exact opposite. It turns out that many of the non-pharmaceutical prescriptions for anxiety and depressive disorders, on which I'm focusing here, and think of the social prescribing kinds of treatments, many of those same things are good for improving everyone's life satisfaction. So that means that if you promote those things in a sort of public health way, you are helping the healthy and the ill at the same time with the same advice and approaches. It also means that you're preventing future illness, because of course if you improve people's mental health in the positive sense, they are less likely to become ill. And that naturally destigmatizes mental illness, because we're all in the same boat together trying to improve how life feels. And so you can avoid, not completely, because of course it's still important to have diagnoses and medical interventions, but significantly, and for a lot of the things that we should be doing to improve people's mental health, you eliminate having a category of people who are named and problematic through diagnosis. Another advantage of the life satisfaction approach is that the statistical analysis explaining how good life feels naturally accounts for or admits explanations that are not at the individual level. In other words, both social and collective causes of mental health, as well as individual ones, are part of the explanatory circumstances in understanding causes. So that means that we're not just treating individuals thinking about mental health as an individual issue. And lastly, the approach, as I've already suggested, gives implicitly, I guess, gives a proper weighting for mental health as compared with physical health in our overall resource allocation. To state that more explicitly, we should be putting more emphasis on mental health investments as compared with physical health compared to what we're doing now, from the point of view of maximizing life satisfaction. Let me now turn to tell you very briefly that governments are already embracing this life satisfaction approach as the way of the future. I showed you earlier the OECD's and Quebec's indicator systems for progress. Consider Canada's overarching policy framework called the Quality of Life Framework. So it has, I can't point here, but it has 5 colored domains of indicators that support the idea of quality of life. But in the center, if you like, above them, is this overarching one, the life satisfaction. Actually, it's life satisfaction and also sense of meaning and purpose in the case of Statistics Canada. Around this system are 2 overarching lenses, one of them about fairness and inclusion, and the other about sustainability and resilience. And I'll come back to these ideas, but it's notable that these are not included in the indicators. So there are not indicators there for inequality or something like that as part of the definition of quality of life. Instead, they are lenses to be used on all of the indicators across all 5 domains. And the same is true of sustainability and resilience, in that that is considered a lens with which to look at how everything is doing. If you go to the data hub at Statistics Canada, you will see the quality of life framework and all of these indicators, but in the 5 domains, as well as being able to track life satisfaction. One thing about this framework is that the details of what's measured in these 5 domains is called by Statistics Canada evergreen. In other words, it'll always be subject to new evidence about what is important for the overarching indicator. So the composition of what goes into those 5 domains is accountable to empirical evidence about what supports life satisfaction. Let me summarize my talk by telling you 3 roles for life satisfaction in guiding policy. Number 1 is somewhat symbolic. By putting something on top of an indicator system, which is so easy and so intuitive, and is a single measure that's always easy to understand mathematically, we communicate the overall gist, the overall intent of the indicator system without requiring people to look at the details. So this is a way of saying, look, if you don't want to read the details of our indicators and our sub-objectives, you can at least know that the goal of our government or of all policy is to build better lives for people. In other words, government is accountable to the experience of people. It's also, very importantly, a way to frame policy positively. In the same tradition of, in the same sense that I mentioned for mental health, and given to us by movements like positive psychology and nowadays positive education, there's a lot of value to having positive framing. The second role is to give empirical accountability to a broader dashboard of indicators. So you've just seen an example of that Canada is doing. And ideally, those indicators are largely or entirely objective. Statistical analysis then gives us inference about how important different secondary measures are for determining overall life satisfaction across individuals and across time. That provides guidance as to which indicators should be in and which should be out of a measurement dashboard. It makes such measurement dashboards somewhat apolitical and therefore, hopefully, have better longevity. It makes very clear what an objective is and what a means to that objective is. And the third role is to go a step further and learn quantitative weights for all those secondary outcomes, building a cost-benefit system that ultimately can prioritize interventions and tell you what the most cost-effective ways are to allocate your next $1 and $1 billion, to allocate your resources from the point of view of improving lives. So this is an example I've already told you about. This is the well-being cost-benefit accounting approach. Now, one drawback of having a clear definition and precision about empirical evidence is that the life satisfaction approach cannot do everything. So, in my view, the science of well-being ends with a distribution. In other words, in evaluating how a population is doing, we can't in principle do that by a mean. We're left with a distribution of the responses between 0 and 10. If we're evaluating how we think a policy will perform, we're left with a distribution of changes to life satisfaction, not with a single number. Nothing tells us that policy should target the average or how to aggregate across a population. Now note that the well-be approach I already told you about already does exactly that. It takes an average. And of course, in doing so, it does tend to favor those who are suffering over those who are doing well, simply based on maybe logic, but based on empirical evidence that the low-hanging fruit for improving lives tends to be those who are not already thriving. But ultimately, the point is that we need still political discourse and debate in order to know what to think and what to do about the shape of the distribution. Secondly, and this is a much longer conversation, there's a class of problems that I call sustainability, which refers to complex systems, long-term horizons, and/or high uncertainty. And I argue that we cannot deal with those in the same cost-benefit paradigm as we do other kinds of investments. And really the intuition for this is simply that if you are trying to make policy, if you're trying to make decisions using a cost-benefit system, and you include this kind of complex system in there, then all your decisions will be completely overwhelmed by the uncertainty that comes from those parts. And so it's just not practical on one level to make calculations based on a well-being thinking about such long-term, complex, high uncertainty questions. So in the way I think about those is that they should come into policy making more as constraints rather than an objective. But as I said, that's a longer conversation. I think I just went backwards. Now, it's interesting that we often see well-being language used to label values of equity and environmental sustainability all packaged into one. Those are the things I just said that I don't think the life satisfaction approach can handle. That's true here. That's true here. It's true in also, many places, including the recent Quebec prevention plan. These may be important endeavors, such as, so this one, for instance, a well-being economy delivers social justice on a healthy planet. These may be important endeavors, but they are not constraining themselves to an evidence-based approach to policy. The life satisfaction approach gives us guidance about what matters in a nonpartisan way and with scientific humility. Let me finish by mentioning how I think we can work together to put this knowledge into practice. We've all seen how public health has championed well-being as more than absence of disease. It's instead the WHO's state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, for example. So what if subjective well-being gave us the compass to steer all policies, not just health policies, towards lives people value, and in a way that is empirically accountable to the actual experience of people living those lives? What if our objective wasn't just healthier populations, but flourishing ones, measured ultimately by what goes on inside people's brains? In her final report this year, Chief Public Health Officer Theresa Tam called for attention to well-being as a unifying goal for collaborative action. And she said that if properly applied, it could help drive evidence-based budgeting and decision-making. However, the body of that report often refers to health and well-being together. This blurs the distinction between expertise and interventions based on the evidence about illness and health outcomes versus a broader goal and different body of evidence about what makes for good lives according to those who experience them. So here's my first call to action, is to take care with definitions and be deliberate about using some of these labels. My take is that all of these words really mean nothing without a measurable definition. They're used for whatever people want, and sometimes that's just branding or rhetoric to support someone's pre-existing agenda. Some of them are quite explicitly branding, but this word well-being has become fashionable and vague. Life satisfaction is not the only approach to well-being, but it does do a nice job of separating a broader concept from narrower objectives, such as health. Secondly, I'm asking for you to embrace the empirical science of well-being as an overarching guide to public policy. Public health has a critical role to play in supporting and elevating initiatives like the Federal Quality of Life Framework. If it's to gain traction, it needs the support of key communities and bodies of expertise like that of public health. The life satisfaction approach properly weights prevention over later treatment. The public health community already has a lot of implementation knowledge, for instance, on community interventions and upstream action, to complement the downstream outcome measurement and motivation provided by an evidence-based framework on well-being. And just to conclude, I believe that this idea is very powerful, and that working together, policy sectors can build a new discourse, a new story, with enormous possibilities for true progress. Thank you very much.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Parfait. Donc, nous serons prêts à prendre des questions. Donc, n'hésitez pas, si vous avez des questions pour professeur Barrington-Leigh, venez au micro, puis on pourra les prendre dans l'ordre. On a une quinzaine de minutes pour ça. Je peux peut-être briser la glace.
Non, mais allez-y.
Non, allez-y.
OK, Stéphane Roche, je suis le directeur scientifique de l'Institut en environnement, développement, société à l'Université Laval. J'ai une question qui est plus une curiosité. J'aimerais savoir ce que vous pensez par rapport à tout ce que vous nous avez dit. Vous savez, il y a une série québécoise qui s'appelle Le bonheur intérieur brut. Je ne sais pas si vous avez vu ça, ou si vous la connaissez ou pas. Et si oui, vous en pensez quoi? Parce que c'est une série qui est quand même basée sur une espèce d'indice qui a été pensé il y a quelques années autour de 11 caractéristiques.
Est-ce que c'est basé à Sherbrooke? Université de Sherbrooke?
Non, c'est une série télévisée qui s'appelle...
OK. Non, je ne connais pas. Bon, désolé.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y aurait d'autres questions? On a quelqu'un qui s'en vient au micro. Donc, simplement vous nommer puis poser votre question.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Marie-Pierre. I was actually wondering what's your take on the impact that have like social media in our life, because we know that mostly people today are exposed to a quite tinted, sometimes embellished version of life. And we saw in the first graphic that you showed that people are, well, the vision of our satisfaction is declining. But I think when we are highly exposed to sometimes this different vision of life of people living a beautiful life outside, do you think it has an impact of how we see of our own perception of our life?
Thank you for the questions. A lot of people are asking that, as you can imagine, and the evidence is not, well, as with all evidence, it's not simple or unanimous, I would say. But I would say that it might be one of the most important things going on, maybe even globally. And so if we were to be reading in the headlines every day that life satisfaction is on decline, I think we would be considering quite serious action. Now, when we're facing new technology, it's difficult to be confident about what action to take, to avoid unintended harms. But I think if we took the precautionary approach, we would at least slow down what is happening. So anyway, maybe I don't know if that's a more or less direct answer, but every year there's something called the World Happiness Report that is published on March 20th. And this March, the entire report is dedicated to this question of youth and social media. It's also, I mentioned something different is going on in, so it is one of the leading theories for why youth are having a hard time worldwide, most of all in Anglophone countries, interestingly. And, I mentioned that in Quebec, youth are doing a bit better than the rest of Canada, and that's mostly due to Francophone Quebecois youth. Now, how could that be? Well, it's possible that some of the toxic effects of social media are strongest in the Anglo-dominated social media. I don't know exactly how to test that yet. Anyway, there needs to be much more attention to this question. I think it's urgent. There have been, you may know, a number of RCTs, really good studies on what happens when you take social media or cell phones away from people. And it seems like many youth want to have their social media as long as everyone else does, but would prefer that nobody had it, which is a good sign that it's a collective action problem with a net negative impact. I've advocated, I think there are some things that we could do without the risk of unintended harms, which would not take away the system or the choice, but really remove the advertising model in which advertising is now allowed to be based on knowledge about an individual. I don't think humans are anywhere near strong enough to defend ourselves against that. And so if you allowed advertising to only take account of the immediate context in which somebody is browsing or something, like in a newspaper, right? You place an ad next to something somebody has chosen, but you don't allow it to be targeted based on what you know from the past about an individual. That wouldn't change the system, but it would slow down some of the effects maybe, but take away the sort of most dystopian possibilities of what the current AI systems can do to manipulate people.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting.
Merci beaucoup. On a une autre question au fond.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question concerne les deux éléments de contrainte que vous avez abordés là, sur la distribution puis la durabilité. Avoir une expertise populationnelle au niveau de la santé publique, pour moi, c'est quand même difficile de voir l'utilité d'un indicateur qu'on ne pourrait pas croiser par rapport à ces deux éléments-là qui sont vraiment très importants pour améliorer la santé de la population au complet. Puis je pense que si on ne le prend pas en compte dans notre façon de considérer les indicateurs, on risque vraiment d'augmenter les inéquités. C'est ce qu'on a vu par le passé. Donc, je voulais vous entendre sur comment est-ce qu'on traite cette information-là pour ne pas créer d'effets négatifs là, d'augmenter les inégalités.
Pour ne pas créer quoi? En français, juste si vous pourriez répéter.
Oui, de ne pas avoir d'effets contradictoires pour, par exemple, augmenter les problèmes liés à la distribution, puis augmenter les problèmes liés à la durabilité si on focus seulement sur les indicateurs de satisfaction à la vie.
Thank you for that question. As I said, I have lots more to say about how to think about sustainability. So, but you've asked about both of the limitations. To start with something concrete, let me point to the Canadian Quality of Life Framework that I mentioned, which addresses, highlights both of those as top considerations, but doesn't reduce them to part of an indicator system or part of a single scalar index, for instance. So it says, if you are looking at, for instance, household income is one of the indicators under one of the 5 domains, but the lens then says, well, we should be disaggregating that indicator. We're not interested in average. All of these indicators should be disaggregated as much as the data allow, and StatCan is doing a great job right now of making the whole quality of life framework indicators available at community level as much as possible. So, sorry, not just community level, but being able to disaggregate across the normal demographic slices that we're usually interested in when we think about equity. So, in a sense, the answer is that, as I mentioned, life satisfaction is not restricting us or telling us what to do. It's leaving the problem of how to deal with overall distributions up to policymakers. I guess that picture misses out on something. To the extent that inequality has effects in the future on well-being outcomes, for instance, through insufficient human capital investment, or through the fact that people actually don't like living in an unequal society. Now, those are empirical questions of to the extent those are true, but they are true to some degree. And of course, that all is included in a life satisfaction framework. That's the extent to which, if you pick a measure of inequality or you pick some aspect of distribution, it's actually known to affect life satisfaction. That's in there. What isn't in there is, so I think that actually addresses most of your question, right? So the idea of doing harm by not including a simplified measure of the distribution or a simplified measure of inequality, I don't think that's a problem, because if you're doing harm in terms of life satisfaction, that should be part of your calculus. That should be part of your knowledge about returns to investment on all of these objective intermediate outcomes that ultimately affect well-being. Okay, so I think I've waffled around that question as much as I can, and then my approach to sustainability, I'm absolutely not a fan of thinking about human well-being as though well-being of other species don't matter, or the well-being of those who are still to humans who are still to be born doesn't matter. I just don't think that life satisfaction evidence is really useful for more than thinking about a generational time scale. So thinking about our investments in a life course or two. And so we need something else to handle that. And for me, that looks like the precautionary principle. So for the things that we cannot accommodate in something that is ultimately an optimization framework using life satisfaction approach, we need to have a cautionary approach which says, for instance, complex systems shouldn't change too fast because we don't know the impact. In fact, I think this spirit is encapsulated a little bit by what you often find in indigenous frameworks of well-being, which is to say that we are connected to these other things, or all things are connected. And for me, that's language for we don't know what happens if those things change quickly. So if we see some balance in our global ecosystem changing rapidly, we're not going to be able to do a cost-benefit analysis of everything that's going to go on within 100 years, but we might say this is not safe. And so that comes into policy with a constraint rather than an optimization. I'm not 100% sure you're going to be satisfied with those answers, but I'd be happy to talk about it more if you'd like to chat.
Parfait. On a encore 10 minutes pour vos questions. Donc, peut-être que je pourrais changer de micro. Je vous laisserai celui-ci, puis après ça, on ira à vous.
Bonjour, Manon Blackburn, Institut national de santé publique du Québec, et fière de l'être. Au début de votre présentation, vous avez présenté une carte sur la variation selon les pays. Ce que j'ai remarqué très brièvement, c'est que c'était très élevé dans les pays nordiques, Suède, Finlande, mais aussi en Amérique du Sud. Dans certains pays d'Amérique du Sud, des pays qui, a priori, à mes yeux, n'ont pas la même réalité. Qu'est-ce qui devrait nous inspirer, selon vous, de ces pays-là, en tant que réalité différente, mais de toute évidence, ils ont quelque chose de plus que nous?
So to some extent, there's something called the Latin American anomaly, which is that when we predict life satisfaction around the world, a bunch of Latin American countries are a little happier than we would predict based on the observables we know. So I'm going to give you a not confident answer first, and then something that sounds technical and a bit scary. But the not empirically verified answer, which I justify by saying that we haven't measured everything that we need to. So one of the policy implications of following life satisfaction is we realize that things which national statistical agencies have not done a lot of measuring of might be really important, right? So that's why we measure now measures of trust and social identity or sense of belonging and so on. These are things which initially are measured in subjective ways, and we move towards objective measures. I don't think we have a measure of something like the degree of music and dance in life at the national level, but those things might actually be somewhat fundamental. So that's sort of the uninformed hypothesis for what's going on in some of Latin America. The other is that so some of my recent work focuses very much on measurement problems with life satisfaction in comparing across cultures. So this is something which we reassured ourselves about a long time ago, sort of around 2010 in some sense, that when you translate this language into the question of life satisfaction or life evaluations into all the languages you need around the world, you might imagine people have different conceptions of what a good life is. You might imagine that the translation is difficult. You might imagine that individualist cultures have very different patterns of responses or relationships to circumstances as collectivist cultures. But what we found is that, in fact, the estimates that when we model what determines life satisfaction, we found it's actually quite uniform all around the world, and that only makes sense when you realize how social we are. So around the world, it turns out that the way that we're connecting with other people is really a big driver. I think we're now going through a period of looking at the details one step more carefully. And so it is the case that in some Latin American countries, a lot of people are giving 10s on that scale. And so there are different possibilities for why that is, but it's something that we can account for, at least partly, in our analysis. So these kind of measurement details, I would say, are things which aren't threatening the inference about what it is that causes a good life at the collective or individual level, but they do imply a little bit of extra increasing of confidence intervals when we are making country-to-country comparisons. Thank you for the excellent question.
Merci beaucoup. On aurait le temps pour une dernière question. Je suis désolé. Désolé. Donc, allez-y.
Merci. Éric Lévesque, aussi à l'Institut national de santé publique, où j'espère être pour longtemps. Thank you. That was a very stimulating talk. I was wondering what you feel, actually, who you think, if we look at the typical institutions that exist in most jurisdictions, which ones are best suited to be spearheading efforts to embrace subjective well-being as I say, a reference measure for decision and policy making. And if not public health, do you think that public health should refocus its efforts perhaps around a less broad definition of health and well-being, or something a little bit different that wouldn't, bring potentially confusion between health and subjective well-being?
But now you're asking me to pronounce on the thing I would like to leave, in some sense, up to the public health community to reflect on. The first part of your question is maybe easier for me. Absolutely every level. So right now the UN is revising its guidance on national statistical measures for progress, and it will, according to the latest inside information, almost certainly include subjective well-being. Communities and organizations on every level are also the right place. In fact, in some sense, that's where it started. So it's been easier for people who are tuned into the life satisfaction literature to implement changes in their office or their very local community in a bottom-up way. It was sort of obvious the kinds of things to do on that level before we gained the confidence in the research community to start thinking about that we're ready to start advising central governments about big picture budgeting. So I don't think there's a level in that sense where this is not relevant. As for the role of public health, well, I mean, I show all my cards. I think the two options that you propose are the right ones, right? Either there should be a serious reorientation in the language and conception and empirical backing to how well-being is used in public health, and really to embrace a well-being in all policies as opposed to a health in all policies, which it's for outsiders like me has always been a bit baffling. It doesn't seem like we're creating a healthy population is what my government or life is the meaning of life. So that's one option. And the other is to slightly narrow at least the sensible focus or the language around all the expertise in public health, so that again, it's a bit more understandable for others outside the health sphere to know what the boundaries are.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Merci beaucoup pour les questions et pour les réponses. C'était vraiment très intéressant. Donc, merci beaucoup. Ça mettrait fin à la conférence plénière.
Thank you.
Donc, il y a une pause, puis les activités commencent à 9 h. 10 h, oui, 10 h. Ouh.